The Oval Office, January 20, 2025. I never imagined I would stand here. The weight of the resolute desk beneath my palms feels like destiny itself. Cold mahogany. Carved from the timbers of HMS Resolute, a British ship, ironically. How fitting that I should command from wood that once belonged to an empire that collapsed under its own arrogance. Through the bulletproof windows of the Oval Office, I watch the crowds dispersing from the National Mall. Hundreds of thousands. Perhaps millions. They chanted my name. They waved flags, not the old American flag, but something new. Something purer. The military band still echoes in my skull. Hail to the chief never sounded so perfect. But you want to know the truth, you want to know what really runs through my mind as I sit in the most powerful chair on earth. Fear. Not the fear you'd expect. Not fear of failure or assassination or impeachment. No, I fear that I won't move fast enough. That the window of opportunity will close before I can complete what I've started. History doesn't give second chances. I learned that lesson in a cold prison cell in Landsberg, nearly a century ago, in another life, another timeline. But this isn't 1933 Berlin. This is 2025 Washington, D.C. And the tools at my disposal, they would make Goebbels weep with envy. Let me take you back. Let me show you how we got here. 3 years earlier, the announcement. The political consultants said I was insane. You can't just come out of nowhere, they said. You need political experience. You need donor networks. You need. I fired them all. What I needed was something they couldn't comprehend. I needed rage. American rage. I needed to find the fractures in this society and hammer them until they split wide open. And oh, were there fractures. I announced my candidacy on a Tuesday afternoon in the Rust Belt, Detroit, Michigan. Not Washington. Not New York. Detroit. A city that had been gutted, hollowed out, left to rot by politicians who promised everything and delivered nothing. The abandoned auto factory behind me served as the perfect backdrop. Broken windows. Graffiti. Weeds growing through cracked concrete. The American dream, decomposing. They took your jobs, I said, my voice carrying across the crowd of 3,000. No teleprompter. Never use teleprompters, they make you sound like a robot, disconnected from the people. They shipped your factories to China. They flooded your streets with drugs and called it economic transformation. They told you to learn to code while your children went hungry. The crowd murmured. I could feel them leaning in. They called you deplorable. They called you uneducated. They called you racist for wanting to preserve what your grandfathers built. Louder now. Angrier. Well, I'm here to tell you something they're terrified for you to hear. You were right all along. The roar that followed shook the rusted beams of that dead factory. That was the moment I knew I would win. The algorithm loves anger. You want to know my secret weapon? You think it was rallies, speeches, policy proposals? No. It was social media. In 1933, I had radio and newspapers, primitive tools, but effective for their time. I had to beg, borrow, and steal media coverage. I had to work with the SA to create spectacles violent enough to force journalists to pay attention. But 2025 gave me something infinitely more powerful, algorithmic amplification. Every platform, TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, runs on engagement. And nothing creates engagement like outrage. The algorithms don't care about truth or nuance or complexity. They care about one thing, keeping eyes on screens. So I gave them what they wanted. Every morning at 5:47 a.m., I would post not carefully crafted statements approved by campaign managers. Raw, unfiltered, perfectly calculated provocations. The pharmaceutical companies are poisoning your children and calling it medicine. Harvard admits they discriminate against you because of your skin color and they're proud of it. The FBI just raided a father of 7 for praying outside an abortion clinic. This is what tyranny looks like. True false it didn't matter. By the time fact-checkers scrambled to respond, the posts had already been shared millions of times. The corrections never traveled as far as the original lies. And here's the beautiful part, the fact-checks actually helped me. Every false label, every content warning, every suspension became proof of the conspiracy. They're trying to silence me because I'm telling the truth, I'd say. And my followers would share it even harder, even faster. The algorithm rewarded conflict. So I created conflict constantly. I attacked Hollywood celebrities, they'd respond with outraged tweets, which I'd screenshot and share with captions like "out of touch elites mocking hard-working Americans." I attacked mainstream media, they'd run segments debunking me, which I'd clip and share with captions like "CNN in full panic mode." I attacked my political opponents, they'd call me dangerous, which I'd reframe as "the establishment is terrified of losing power." Every attack on me made me stronger. Within 6 months, I had the third largest social media following in American politics. Within a year, I had the largest. The rallies grew from thousands to tens of thousands. The donations poured in, small dollar donations, mostly. $5 here. $20 there. The People's Campaign. But you're wondering, how did someone with my history, my ideology, my obvious intentions, make it this far? Because I never said the quiet part out loud. The art of dog whistles. I learned from the mistakes of my predecessors. The Nazis who came before me in America, the George Lincoln Rockwells, the Richard Spencers, the various Klan groups, they failed because they were too obvious. They wore swastikas, they shouted Sieg Heil. They made it too easy for normies to dismiss them as fringe lunatics. I wore suits, expensive ones. Navy blue. American flag pin on the lapel. I smiled. I shook hands. I kissed babies. And I used language that allowed people to hear what they wanted to hear. When I talked about preserving Western civilization, professors heard cultural conservatism. But the alt-right heard white nationalism. When I talked about restoring law and order, suburban moms heard safety. But militias heard racial oppression. When I talked about protecting children from dangerous ideologies, Christian parents heard anti-LGBTQ policy. But neo-Nazis heard, well, they heard exactly what I meant them to hear. Plausible deniability is the most powerful weapon in modern politics. I never said anything about race, I could always claim. And technically, I hadn't. I just talked about urban crime and border security and neighborhood preservation and let people's existing biases fill in the blanks. The media would accuse me of racism. I'd act offended. How dare you call me racist? I have supporters of all backgrounds. This is why Americans don't trust you anymore. And my poll numbers would tick up another point. Primary season, the field clears. The Republican primary was a bloodbath. 17 candidates. Senators, governors, businessmen, all thinking they had a shot. Traditional politicians with traditional campaigns. I destroyed them one by one. The front runner was a senator from Florida, young, articulate, Latino heritage. The establishment loved him. The donors loved him. The media called him the future of the party. I called him Little Marco, light stolen nickname, but effective. At the debates, I didn't argue policy. I attacked his masculinity. His height. His voice. Childish, absolutely. Effective, devastatingly so. Look at him, I said during one debate, pointing across the stage. Do you think Xi Jinping would respect that? Do you think Putin would fear that? The audience laughed. The senator tried to respond with policy points about foreign relations. But I'd already won because I'd made it about dominance, not competence. He dropped out after Super Tuesday. The others fell like dominoes. I gave each one a nickname: Crooked Kate, Lion Ted 2.0, Low Energy Brian. The names stuck. The memes spread. My opponents spent their time defending their dignity instead of attacking my positions. Because I had no real positions to attack. Oh, I had slogans. America first forever. Strength through unity. Restore American greatness. But if you actually analyzed my policy proposals, they were deliberately vague. Build the wall, but how tall, where exactly, funded how, doesn't matter. The image was enough. Bring back manufacturing, but which industries with what trade policies doesn't matter. The promise was enough. Restore traditional values, but which traditions enforced how doesn't matter. The sentiment was enough. Specifics create targets. Vagueness creates movements. By May, I'd locked up the nomination. The Republican Party was mine not because they loved me, but because I'd conquered them. The never-Trumpers, the old guard, the Bush dynasty remnants, they either bent the knee or became irrelevant. At the convention, I gave them a choice: join me and win, or oppose me and be destroyed. They joined. The general election, against the machine. My opponent was everything you'd expect. A Democrat. A woman. Former senator, former Secretary of State, decades of experience. The first female major party presidential nominee in 8 years. The media darling. The safe choice. I was going to annihilate her. Not because I was better. Not because my policies made more sense. But because I understood something she didn't: Americans don't vote for competence. They vote for conviction. She talked about incremental progress and evidence-based policy and building coalitions. Boring. Technocratic. The language of managers, not leaders. I talked about enemies. Traitors. Invasions. Existential threats. She released a 90-page economic plan. I said, I'll make America rich again, believe me. She cited studies. I told stories. She appealed to reason. I appealed to rage. The debates were magnificent theater. She'd spend 2 minutes explaining her health care proposal with statistics and pilot programs and cost-benefit analyses. I'd interrupt with, she wants to give free health care to illegal immigrants while your premiums double. How is that fair? The moderators would fact-check me. That's not actually her prop. See, they're protecting her. They're all protecting her. The media, the bureaucrats, the whole corrupt system. Every fact-check proved my point. The polls tightened. The consultants on both sides panicked. How is this even close, they asked. Because they still didn't understand. This wasn't about policy. This was about identity. This was tribal. This was existential. I barnstormed the swing states: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia. Multiple rallies per day. My voice going hoarse. My energy never flagging. She did carefully targeted events with small, vetted crowds. Professional. Controlled. Dead. 3 weeks before the election, the October surprise hit. The October surprise. Someone leaked emails. Thousands of them. DNC internal communications, campaign strategy memos, donor conversations. Who leaked them? Russia, probably. China, maybe. Some 400-pound hacker in his basement possibly. I didn't care. The content was devastating. The Democrats discussing how to manage black voter turnout. Donors asking for policy favors. Campaign staff mocking rural voters as uneducated and easy to manipulate. I don't want your votes, one email said. I just need you to stay home. I read that email aloud at every rally for the next 2 weeks. They don't want your vote. They want your silence. They want you to give up, go home, and let them run your lives. The media tried to focus on the illegality of the hack. The violation of privacy. The potential foreign interference. I focused on the content. I don't care who exposed the truth, I said. I care that the truth was exposed. My opponent's campaign collapsed. Her rallies shrank. Her volunteers demoralized. Her poll numbers cratered. On election night, I won 312 electoral votes. The cities went blue, as expected. But the rural areas, the suburbs, the forgotten corners of America that politicians only visited during campaign season, they went red. Blood red. I won Pennsylvania by 80,000 votes. Wisconsin by 35,000. Arizona by 12,000. Georgia by 8,000. Narrow margins. But enough. At 2:47 a.m., the networks called it. I was president-elect. I stood on the stage in Mar-a-Lago, my campaign headquarters, naturally, and addressed the nation. To those who supported me, thank you. We will make America great again. To those who opposed me, I will be your president too. Give me a chance. You might be surprised. They had no idea what was coming. Transition, the 76 days. Between election and inauguration, I had 76 days to prepare. Most presidents-elect use this time for policy briefings, cabinet selections, diplomatic courtesy calls. Boring administrative work. I used it for something else, loyalty tests. Every cabinet position, every agency head, every key appointment, I didn't care about their qualifications. I cared about one thing: would they obey? My chief of staff was a former general who'd been court-martialed for ignoring unlawful orders. Perfect. My attorney general was a prosecutor who'd built his career on aggressive enforcement and creative interpretations of the law. Perfect. My head of Homeland Security was a sheriff who'd run concentration camps, tent city jails in the desert for immigration violations. Perfect. My national security advisor had written 3 books about the necessity of preemptive war. Perfect. The Senate confirmation hearings were brutal. Democrats grilled each nominee. Are you qualified? Will you uphold the Constitution? Will you resist illegal orders? My nominees gave perfect answers: yes, Senator. Of course, Senator. I will always follow the law, Senator. They were lying. But Senate Republicans held firm. Every nominee confirmed. Some by narrow margins, but enough. I also spent those 76 days doing something else, purging the military. Not officially, of course. That would come later. But I met with every Joint Chief, every regional commander, every officer above the rank of colonel. Are you with me? I'd ask. Some said yes immediately, the true believers, the ones who'd been waiting for someone like me. Some hesitated, the careerists, the ones who cared more about pensions than principles. And some refused, the patriots, the ones who actually meant their oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I made notes, long notes. Inauguration Day, January 20th, 2025. Which brings us back to where we started. The crowds. The ceremony. The oath of office, my hand on the Bible, my voice carrying across the frozen January air. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will to the best of my ability, preserve, protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. Every word a lie, but spoken with such conviction that even I almost believed it. My inaugural address lasted 23 minutes. The historians would later call it the most radical inaugural speech in American history. Some would call it chilling. Others would call it prophetic. I called it necessary. For too long, I said, we have allowed our enemies to define us, to shame us, to convince us that loving our country is somehow hateful, that protecting our borders is somehow cruel, that preserving our heritage is somehow racist. Today, that ends. Starting today, we will no longer apologize for being Americans. We will no longer bow to foreign powers or international organizations that despise us. We will no longer allow our children to be indoctrinated with ideologies that teach them to hate themselves and their history. Starting today, we take America back. The crowds erupted. Not everyone. I could see protesters in the distance, held back by metal barriers and thousands of police. But enough. More than enough. That night, I signed my first executive orders. 17 of them. The first 100 hours. Hour 1, Executive Order 0001, Secure Borders Now Initiative. Deployed 50,000 National Guard troops to the southern border. Declared a national emergency. Suspended asylum hearings indefinitely. The ACLU immediately filed lawsuits. I expected that. Hour 6, Executive Order 0002, Extreme Vetting Protocol. Banned immigration from 23 countries, all majority Muslim, though I never said that part. Just countries that pose a terrorist threat. Protests erupted at airports nationwide. Federal judges issued temporary restraining orders. I ignored them. Hour 12, Executive Order 0003, Law Enforcement Protection Act. Granted federal immunity to police officers for actions taken in the course of maintaining public order. Essentially gave cops permission to do whatever they wanted. Civil rights groups went ballistic. I expected that too. Hour 24, Executive Order 0004, Media Accountability Initiative. Required all journalists covering federal matters to register with the new Office of Media Relations. Said it was about transparency and protecting national security. It was really about building a database of every reporter who might cause problems. The Washington Post published an editorial calling me a dictator. I tweeted it with the caption, "Fake news is the enemy of the people. Always has been." Hour 48, Executive Order 0007, Critical Infrastructure Protection Directive, gave Homeland Security authority to take preventive action against domestic threats to critical infrastructure. Sounds reasonable, right? Who could oppose protecting power plants and water systems? But the definition of critical infrastructure was left deliberately vague. And domestic threats could mean anything. It could mean eco-terrorists trying to sabotage pipelines. Or it could mean protesters blocking traffic. Or it could mean journalists investigating corruption. The vagueness was the point. Hour 72, Executive Order 0011, emergency national census. Ordered an immediate national census including citizenship status questions, political affiliation, and community associations. The Census Bureau protested. I replaced the director. Hour 96, Executive Order 0015, Educational Integrity Restoration Act. Cut federal funding to any school district teaching divisive concepts or anti-American propaganda. Which concepts? Which propaganda? Critical race theory, obviously. Gender ideology. Woke history that portrayed America as fundamentally flawed. Any history that portrayed America as fundamentally flawed. Teachers across the country walked out. I expected that. I'd already drafted the executive order declaring teacher strikes a threat to national security. The resistance begins. By day 5, the protests were massive. New York, 500,000 in the streets. Los Angeles, 400,000. Chicago, 300,000. Even smaller cities Portland, Seattle, Austin, Atlanta, tens of thousands marching. The signs were predictable, not my president. Resist. This is what fascism looks like. They had no idea. The liberal media covered the protests breathlessly. The resistance, they called it. As if hashtags and clever signs would stop what I'd set in motion. My supporters held counter-protests. Smaller, but more organized. More disciplined. And much, much better armed. In Sacramento, the two groups clashed. Pepper spray, fists, broken bottles. 3 people stabbed. 17 hospitalized. The liberal media blamed right-wing agitators. The conservative media blamed Antifa terrorists. I blamed both sides and declared a state of emergency. This violence cannot stand, I said from the Oval Office, my face grave, my voice heavy with manufactured concern. I'm authorizing federal law enforcement to restore order in affected cities. Anyone engaging in violence or destruction of property will face swift justice. What I didn't say, I'd already pre-positioned tactical teams in major cities. Federal marshals, DHS special units, and contractors, private military companies happy to do what regular soldiers might refuse. When protesters threw rocks at a federal building in Portland, the response was overwhelming. Tear gas, flashbangs, rubber bullets, mass arrests. The media showed footage of bleeding protesters, crying children, elderly people knocked to the ground. My press secretary called it necessary force against violent rioters, and here's the thing, half the country agreed with me. Not the half watching MSNBC and reading the New York Times. But the half watching different channels, reading different websites, living in different Americas. They saw the footage of burning police cars from 2020. They saw the looting. They saw cities descending into chaos while politicians called it mostly peaceful. They wanted order. They wanted strength. I gave them both. The Purge, Month 2. By February, I'd moved past executive orders to something more systematic, removal. Every federal agency has layers of bureaucrats, career civil servants who've worked under multiple administrations, who think their job is to serve the institution rather than the president. They were wrong. I issued a new directive: every federal employee at GS-13 level or above must sign a loyalty oath. Not to the Constitution, they'd already done that. To me. To my administration's agenda. I will faithfully execute the directives of the President and his appointed officials without obstruction or delay. The unions went insane. This is illegal. This is unconstitutional. My Attorney General disagreed. Approximately 40% of senior federal employees refused to sign. They were terminated within 48 hours. The FDA, the EPA, the Department of Education, the State Department gutted overnight. Decades of institutional knowledge walked out the door. Exactly as planned. Because those institutions weren't there to help me. They were obstacles. They would slow walk my orders, leak to the press, find legal technicalities to obstruct. Better to burn it down and rebuild with loyalists. The replacements came quickly. Young, ambitious, ideologically committed. People who'd been writing angry blog posts and making YouTube videos about the deep state for years. Now they were the state. The Supreme Court problem. The lawsuits piled up. Hundreds of them. My travel ban, unconstitutional. My deployment of troops, unconstitutional. My suspension of asylum, unconstitutional. My loyalty oath, unconstitutional. Lower courts issued injunctions, stays, temporary restraining orders. I ignored most of them. These so-called judges, I tweeted, think they can overrule the will of the American people. They're wrong. The cases raced toward the Supreme Court. And here's where I had a problem, the court was split 6-3 conservative, yes. But conservative didn't mean loyal to me. 3 of the justices were strict constitutional textualists. They'd uphold the law even if it opposed my agenda. 2 were religious conservatives who cared more about abortion and religious freedom than executive power. Only 1 was truly in my camp, a former Federalist Society member who believed in the unitary executive theory, basically, that the president has almost unlimited power within the executive branch. I needed to change those numbers. In March, I floated a trial balloon, an interview with a friendly journalist. You know, FDR tried to expand the court when it blocked his agenda. Maybe we should consider that again. 9 justices made sense in 1789, but is that the right number for modern America? The backlash was immediate and bipartisan. Court packing. Screamed the headlines. This crosses a line. Said Republican senators. Good. Because now the court knew, rule against me too many times, and I'd destroy you. The first major case hit the court in April, American Civil Liberties Union v. President Adolf Hitler, challenging my travel ban. The vote was 5-4 to uphold. The swing vote, one of the textualist justices who'd been appointed by a previous Republican president. His opinion was careful, narrow, legalistic. But the conclusion was clear, the president has broad authority over immigration. I'd won. After that, the court became much more cooperative. The media problem. The press was relentless. Every day, new investigations. New leaks. New scandals. President's business empire profits from foreign deals. White House staffers describe chaotic and dangerous environment. Secret memo reveals plans for mass deportations. Some of it was true. Some was exaggerated. Some was completely fabricated. All of it was a problem. I'd already declared them enemies of the people. I'd already banned certain outlets from press briefings. I'd already sicked my Twitter followers on individual journalists. But they kept coming. So I escalated. In May, federal agents raided the offices of the Washington Post. The warrant claimed they were investigating illegal leaks of classified information. They seized servers, documents, reporters' notes. They arrested 2 senior editors. The journalism community exploded. This is Nixon on steroids. This is the end of press freedom. My press secretary was calm, no one is above the law, If journalists break the law by publishing classified information, they face consequences. This shouldn't be controversial. The Post hired the best lawyers in the country. The case would take years. I had years. In the meantime, the raid had its intended effect, sources dried up. Leakers got scared. Whistleblowers stayed quiet. And here's the beautiful part, I didn't have to raid every newspaper. I just had to raid one. The others would self-censor out of fear. Fox News became more sycophantic than ever. They didn't report news anymore, they reported my version of news. CNN and MSNBC still criticized me, but their access to the White House was completely cut off. No press credentials. No interviews. No information beyond what I chose to release publicly. They became increasingly irrelevant. And the independent journalists, the bloggers and podcasters who'd built their audiences on exposing corruption, some were brave. Some kept digging. Some had their homes raided by the FBI for tax irregularities. Some found their bank accounts frozen for ties to foreign actors. Some just disappeared from social media. Deplatformed for terms of service violations. Algorithmic assassination. The military question. The biggest risk to my presidency wasn't the courts or the media or the protesters. It was the military. 450,000 active duty troops. Another 800,000 reserves and National Guard. The most powerful military in human history. If they turned against me, if the generals decided I'd gone too far and ordered their troops to remove me, I'd be finished. So I moved carefully. First, I replaced the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The previous chairman was a career officer who took his oath to the Constitution very seriously. Too seriously. I nominated a general who'd built his career on counterinsurgency and enhanced interrogation techniques. Someone who understood that sometimes you have to break rules to protect the nation. The Senate confirmation was contentious, but he got through. Next, I accelerated military retirements. Any general or admiral who showed even a hint of resistance suddenly found themselves accepting voluntary retirement deals. Some went quietly. Some made angry speeches about defending democracy. I replaced them with younger officers. Colonels jumped to generals. Captains became colonels. People who owed their stars to me. Then I did something unprecedented, I created a new military branch. The Presidential Protection Force. Officially, it was just an expansion of the Secret Service. More agents to protect me and my family given the increased threats. Unofficially, it was my personal army. 10,000 troops. Recruited from special operations units, police departments, and private military companies. Answerable only to me. Not to Congress. Not to the Joint Chiefs. To me. They wore black uniforms with an eagle insignia. They trained at a secret facility in Montana. They were equipped with the best weapons, the best vehicles, the best intelligence. And they were fanatically loyal. Because I'd learned from history, every dictator who fell did so because he lost control of the men with guns. I would not make that mistake. The Congress problem. By summer, my relationship with Congress had completely broken down. The House was split. Republicans had a narrow majority, but it was fractious. Some were never Trumpers who'd bend the knee publicly but obstruct privately. Others were mega true believers who wanted me to move faster, harder. The Senate was worse. Republicans had 52 seats, but at least 10 senators regularly voted against my priorities. And the Democrats, they'd gone from resistance to obstruction to something approaching open rebellion. They held press conferences daily denouncing me. They introduced articles of impeachment monthly. They subpoenaed every member of my administration. They had no idea how irrelevant they'd become. In July, I gave a prime-time address from the Oval Office. My fellow Americans, for 6 months I've tried to work with Congress. I've extended olive branches, I've sought compromise. But at every turn, I've been met with obstruction from politicians who care more about their partisan games than about your safety and prosperity. I'm done waiting. Tonight, I'm invoking emergency powers under the National Emergencies Act to bypass congressional gridlock and implement the agenda you elected me to deliver. Constitutional scholars immediately pointed out that the National Emergencies Act doesn't actually grant the president legislative power. I didn't care. I issued a series of emergency directives that functioned exactly like laws. Mandatory e-verify for all employers, mass deportations would follow. Federal hiring freeze except for law enforcement, shrink the bureaucracy. Reallocation of all foreign aid to border security, America first. Suspension of refugee admissions until extreme vetting completed. Congress howled. This is illegal. This is a coup. But here's the thing, who would stop me? The courts. I'd already packed the lower courts with my judges. The Supreme Court had shown it would defer to me on national security. The military. I'd purged the resistors and promoted the loyalists. The people half loved me. The other half was too divided and demoralized to organize effective resistance. Congress held votes to override my emergency declarations. They passed in the House. They failed in the Senate by 3 votes. 3 Republican senators who'd promised to be a check on my power folded when I threatened to campaign against them in their next primaries. Fear is the most effective form of control. The midterm elections, November 2026. By the time the midterm elections rolled around, I'd been in office for 22 months. Historians would later call this period the consolidation. Others would call it the descent. The economy was complicated. Stock market down 15% from when I took office. Investors don't like uncertainty, and I'd created constant chaos. Unemployment was up as undocumented workers were deported and businesses struggled to find replacements. But my voters didn't care about those metrics. They cared about their neighborhoods feeling safer, more police, more arrests, more fear. They cared about their kids' schools dropping woke curriculum, book bans and teacher intimidation. They cared about seeing people who looked different from them being rounded up and removed, confirmation of their fears and prejudices. They felt like they were winning. The Democratic Party made the midterms a referendum on me. Save Democracy was their slogan. They recruited moderate candidates in swing districts. They raised unprecedented amounts of money. And they got crushed. How? Because I'd spent 2 years changing the rules. Voting restrictions passed in Republican-controlled states, stricter ID requirements, reduced early voting, purged voter rolls, fewer polling places in minority neighborhoods. Election security, we called it, gerrymandering that would make 19th-century Tammany Hall bosses jealous. Districts that looked like abstract art, carefully carved to dilute Democratic votes. And in the final month before elections, a wave of voter fraud investigations in swing districts, all targeting Democratic-leaning voters. People showing up to vote only to find their registrations had been flagged as suspicious. Were these tactics legal? Barely. Were they ethical? No. Were they effective? Absolutely. Republicans gained 12 seats in the House. Gained 4 in the Senate. Now I had a filibuster-proof majority. Now the real work could begin. The legislation, January 2027. With Congress under my complete control, I unleashed a legislative blitz, the Heritage Protection Act, made it a federal crime to remove or deface any monument or statue. Mandatory minimum 5 years in prison. This wasn't really about monuments. This was about criminalizing protest and establishing precedent for harsh sentences. The Parental Rights in Education Act banned any discussion of gender identity or sexual orientation in schools, K-12. Required teachers to inform parents if students expressed any confusion about their gender. This wasn't really about education. This was about forcing LGBTQ kids back into closets and creating a surveillance system where children feared their teachers. The American Worker Protection Act mandated E-Verify for all employment, with criminal penalties for businesses that hired undocumented workers. Established a tip line where Americans could report suspected illegal aliens. This wasn't really about jobs. This was about creating a network of informants and making every person of color subject to random citizenship checks. The Critical Infrastructure Defense Act classified protests near pipelines, power plants, or government buildings as domestic terrorism. Mandatory minimum 10 years. This wasn't about infrastructure. This was about criminalizing environmental activism and political dissent. The Media Transparency Act required all news organizations to disclose their funding sources and register foreign correspondents. Established an Office of Media Integrity to investigate disinformation. This wasn't about transparency. This was about building files on journalists and creating legal pretexts to shut down unfriendly outlets. Each bill passed with only Republican votes. Democrats walked out in protest. I signed them all in a single ceremony, surrounded by cheering supporters. The swamp fought us, I said. The elites resisted us. The media lied about us. But we won. The first arrest, March 2027. His name was Marcus Chen. A former deputy director at the FBI. One of the officials I'd fired in my first week purge. He'd been quietly leaking information to journalists, details about my conversations with foreign leaders, evidence of corruption, plans for what he called concentration camps. My DOJ had been investigating him for months. Wiretaps, surveillance, financial records. On March 15, 2027, federal agents arrested him at his home in Virginia. The charges: espionage, theft of classified information, conspiracy to overthrow the government. That last charge was creative. His lawyers called it absurd. But we had evidence, encrypted messages discussing removing the threat, organizing resistance networks, coordinating with foreign journalists. We'd fabricated most of it, of course. But it looked real enough. His arrest sent shockwaves through the bureaucracy. If a former FBI deputy director wasn't safe, who was? That was the point. The trial was scheduled for September. The prosecutors were seeking the death penalty. The crisis, June 2027. Everything I'd built could have collapsed in June 2027. A tropical storm, Hurricane Elena, slammed into Louisiana as a Category 4. New Orleans flooded again. Thousands trapped. Hundreds dead in the initial surge. The response required coordination: FEMA, Coast Guard, National Guard, local authorities working together to evacuate survivors, restore power, provide aid. But I'd gutted FEMA. Replaced career disaster response experts with political loyalists. Cut the budget to redirect funds to border security. The response was catastrophic. Rescue helicopters that couldn't fly because they hadn't been maintained. Supplies that never arrived because distribution networks had been dismantled. Emergency shelters that didn't open because staff had been fired. The media coverage was devastating. Images of bodies floating in flooded streets. Interviews with survivors who'd waited days for rescue. Comparisons to Hurricane Katrina's failed response except worse. My approval rating, which had been holding steady around 46%, dropped to 39% overnight. This should have been my undoing. This should have been the moment when the country united against me, when even my supporters realized I was incompetent and dangerous. But I'd learned from history. I flew to Louisiana. Walked through the devastation. Hugged crying survivors. Promised unlimited federal aid. And then I found the scapegoat. The Democratic governor, I said in a press conference from a destroyed neighborhood, refused to coordinate with federal authorities. She put politics ahead of people. She let them die to make me look bad. It was a complete lie. She'd been begging for federal help from day one. But I had my allies in right-wing media repeat it endlessly. I had social media bots amplify it. I had my press secretary say it in the daily briefing. Within 48 hours, the narrative shifted from federal failure to democratic obstruction. My supporters believed it because they wanted to believe it. Because the alternative that I was dangerously incompetent was too terrifying to accept. By the end of the month, my approval was back to 44%. The Louisiana governor faced recall petitions. Death threats. Her political career was over. Mine continued. The problem of dissent. By late 2027, I'd been in office for nearly 3 years. I'd consolidated power in ways that would have seemed impossible in the America of 2024. But there was still opposition. Not organized opposition, I'd crushed most of that. But scattered resistance. Individuals and small groups who refused to comply. Journalists who kept digging despite the risks. Lawyers who kept filing lawsuits despite knowing they'd lose. Teachers who kept teaching honest history despite the laws. Local officials who refused to cooperate with immigration raids. Federal employees who slow-walked my orders despite the loyalty oaths. Termites eating away at my authority. I needed an example. A demonstration of what happened to people who defied me. In October 2027, we arrested her. Sarah Martinez. A federal judge in California who'd ruled against my administration in 47 consecutive cases. Immigration, environmental regulations, voting rights, she blocked everything. My DOJ had been building a case against her for months. We discovered that her husband, a technology consultant, had once worked for a company that had ties to a Chinese firm. Thin, absolutely. But enough. The charges: espionage, corruption, failure to disclose foreign contacts. We arrested her in her courtroom. Agents in tactical gear, guns drawn, in front of cameras I'd made sure were present. The footage played on every network. A federal judge, handcuffed, led away while her bailiff and clerk watched in horror. The message was clear: no one is untouchable. The legal community erupted. The American Bar Association called for investigations. Judges across the country signed letters of protest. I didn't care. Because the next day, 3 federal judges who'd been blocking my policies suddenly ruled in my favor. Fear is the most effective form of control. The question you're asking. I can see it in your eyes. The question you want to ask but are afraid to voice: how did this happen? How did America fall so fast? The answer is simpler than you think: it didn't fall. It was always capable of this. The foundation was always cracked. America was built on genocide and slavery. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The Founding Fathers wrote pretty words about liberty while owning human beings. The capacity for fascism was always there. The internment camps for Japanese Americans in 1942. McCarthyism in the 1950s. COINTELPRO. The war on drugs as a tool of racial control. Guantanamo Bay. All I did was remove the polite facade. I didn't create the racism, it was already there, simmering under the surface of every neighborhood dispute about property values and every coded conversation about urban crime. I didn't create the authoritarianism Americans have always worshipped: strong men, from Andrew Jackson to J. Edgar Hoover to Dick Cheney. I didn't create the tribalism the country was already dividing itself into red and blue, Fox News and MSNBC, people who'd rather die than admit the other side had a point. I just accelerated what was already happening. The present day, December 2027. Which brings us to now. 3 years into my presidency. The longest 3 years in American history. The Constitution still exists technically. Congress still meets. Courts still operate. Elections are still held. But it's all theater now. Congress passes the laws I tell them to pass. Courts rule the way I expect them to rule. Elections are free and fair in the sense that people can vote, but the outcomes are predetermined through gerrymandering, voter suppression, and when necessary, creative ballot counting. I just won re-election with 54% of the vote. Some international observers called it compromised. The European Union refused to certify it as legitimate. I don't need their certification. The opposition has collapsed. The Democratic Party is in disarray, split between moderates who want to work within the system and radicals who want to burn it all down. Neither faction has any power. The media has been neutered. The major networks either support me or stay silent. The independent journalists who continue to criticize me find themselves with fewer and fewer platforms. The resistance that filled the streets in my first months is gone. Some gave up. Some were arrested. Some simply got tired. Authoritarianism doesn't usually come with jackboots and midnight raids. It comes with exhaustion. You get tired of protesting. You get tired of being outraged. You get tired of fighting battles you always lose. You have bills to pay and kids to raise and lives to live. And slowly, you accept it. You stop talking about politics at work. You watch what you post on social media. You teach your children to be careful about what they say. You become complicit through silence. The camps. You want to know about the camps, don't you? Everyone always wants to know about the camps. We don't call them concentration camps, of course. That would be too obvious, too historical, too honest. We call them migrant processing centers. There are 47 of them now, spread across the Southwest. Capacity, 2.3 million people. Therefore undocumented immigrants awaiting deportation, officially. But deportation is slow. Paperwork is complicated. Countries won't always take people back. So they wait. Sometimes for months. Sometimes for years. The conditions adequate, according to our reports. Clean water, basic medical care, meals twice a day. The reality: overcrowded barracks. Inadequate sanitation. Children separated from parents. Medical neglect. Abuse. Of course there's abuse. You put thousands of angry, scared, traumatized people in camps guarded by men with guns and unlimited authority, and there's going to be abuse. But we don't document it. We don't investigate it. We don't prosecute it. We just deny it exists. And most Americans believe the denial. Because the alternative that their country is running concentration camps is too horrible to accept. Cognitive dissonance is a powerful drug. What comes next? You want to know what happens next, don't you? Where does this end? It doesn't. I'm 138 years old in spirit, but this body is younger. I have decades left. And even after I'm gone, the system I built will continue. I've appointed 412 federal judges. They'll serve for life. I've remade the military into a force that follows orders without question. I've created a surveillance state that would make the Stasi jealous. I've normalized violence against dissent, criminalized opposition, weaponized the law against my enemies. I've shown that it can be done. And once people see that it can be done, once they realize that democratic norms are just social conventions that can be ignored, once they learn that power comes from fear rather than consent, there's no going back. The America you knew is dead. I killed it. In its place, I'm building something purer, stronger, more unified. A nation that knows who it is and isn't afraid to act on it. A nation that puts its own people first, even if that means putting others in camps. A nation that prizes order over freedom, security over liberty, unity over diversity. A nation that looks a lot like the one I tried to build before, but with better technology and bigger weapons. The final question. I can see one last question in your eyes. The one everyone eventually asks, do you feel any guilt, any remorse? And here's the truth that will horrify you, no. Because I genuinely believe I'm right. I believe that nations need strong leaders who aren't afraid to make hard decisions. I believe that multiculturalism is a failure, that diversity weakens rather than strengthens, that some cultures are better than others. I believe that democracy is a beautiful lie that collapses the moment people stop believing in it. I believe that people want to be led. They crave authority. They need someone to tell them who they are and what they should fear and who they should hate. And I've given them that. Am I a monster by your definition? Probably. But by my definition, I'm a realist. I'm someone who saw where history was heading and decided to ride the wave rather than be drowned by it. The 21st century belongs to strong men. Xi Jinping, Putin, Orban, Modi, Erdogan, and now me. This is the world we're building. Not the liberal democratic order your grandparents believed in. Not the arc of history bending toward justice. The arc of history bends toward whoever is strong enough to bend it. Epilogue, your choice. So here we are. You've seen how it happened. You've seen how quickly it can fall apart. You've seen how a democratic republic can transform into an authoritarian state in less than 3 years. And now you have a choice. You can tell yourself this is fiction. A cautionary tale. An exaggeration. It could never happen here. But it already is happening. Maybe not this exact scenario. Maybe not this quickly. Maybe not this overtly. But the mechanisms are all there, the tribal division. The normalized lying. The attacks on institutions. The demonization of opponents. The erosion of norms. The cult of personality. All the ingredients are present. They're just waiting for the right chef. So what will you do? Will you pay attention? Will you resist? Will you defend the principles you claim to believe in, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's scary, even when it costs you something? Or will you do what most people do, hope someone else handles it? Assume it won't get that bad. Prioritize your comfort over your principles. The choice is yours. But choose quickly. Because we're watching. Ending, the horror you didn't see coming. Actually, There's one more thing I should tell you. One detail I left out. This isn't a hypothetical. You've been reading this thinking it's a creative exercise. A what-if scenario. Dark fiction. But look around you. Look at your world. The surveillance. The division. The normalized corruption. The creeping authoritarianism. I didn't invent any of this. I just told you what's already happening, with the names and dates changed slightly. The camps exist. The judges are being appointed. The institutions are being hollowed out. The media is being neutered. The opposition is being criminalized. Maybe not by someone named Adolf Hitler, but by someone. Right now. In your country. And you're letting it happen. Because it's easier to read about it as fiction than to confront it as reality. Because it's more comfortable to think that could never happen here than to admit it's happening right now. Because accepting the truth would require you to do something about it. And doing something is hard. So you'll close this document. You'll go back to your life. You'll tell yourself it was just a story. And while you do that, we'll keep building. One executive order at a time. One loyalty oath at a time. One disappeared dissident at a time. Until it's too late. Until you wake up one morning and realize you're living in a country you don't recognize. Until you try to speak up and find that the mechanisms of dissent have been dismantled. Until you reach for rights that no longer exist. And then you'll remember this document. You'll remember that someone warned you. Someone showed you exactly how it happens. Someone gave you the blueprint. And you did nothing. Sweet dreams.